Hello, everybody out there. It's really lovely to see so many people tuning in on what is a sloppy night here in Oberlin, and I understand as well in Virginia. I am Carol Lasser. I am the executive director of the Wilson Bruce Evans Home Historical Society. You probably know a lot about this society if you've made it to this Zoom. And I've been looking forward to this opportunity to hear from Bill Chapman and Jerome Bias for quite a while. They came and visited us at the Evans House at the beginning of December 2024 and helped me see the house with entirely new eyes. Jerome is a cultural heritage practitioner whose work includes not only carpentry, but also cuisine. Bill Chapman has expertise in historic home restoration, and I hope that you will see why I spent hours fascinated listening to them as they tell us about what they found exploring the home and furniture of abolitionist and cabinet maker Wilson Bruce Evans. As I understand it, Bill and Jerome will do a presentation that's about 50 minutes long. You can enter questions in the chat at any point, and we'll circle back around to do some answers to questions at the end of their presentation. So without further ado, I will mute myself and put myself take myself off video and turn it over to you, Bill and Jerome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Carol, and thank you for having us. I guess my name is Bill Chapman, and I want to start by maybe answering the question about how a guy from Virginia and a guy from North Carolina wound up in Oberlin at the Wilson Bruce Evans home. And for me, it starts with I'm the kind of guy who tends to fall into rabbit holes and then dig and dig and dig. And behind me, if you can see in the very background on the wall, is an engraving of John Brown that I found in an antique mall in Virginia about 12 years ago, and it's inscribed by Henrietta Leary Evans. So I won't go into that whole story right now, but that opened the gateway for me to this amazing family. And for years, I was doing additional research and then saw the founding of the Wilson Bruce Evans Home Historical Society. Meanwhile, I also met this other guy, Jerome, and we came together at Montpelier, in Virginia, James Madison's home. We met there. We were the two guys who were getting the tour of the house, and the docent was telling us all this and that about James Madison. And I'm in one corner looking at the trim, and Jerome's in another corner looking at the trim. I'm like, okay, we get each other. So Jerome actually has spent a lot of time studying free black tradesmen, cabinet makers, and the work of enslaved blacks in the 18th and 19th century, and is from the Hillsborough area in North Carolina, which I'll tell you more about. So the two of us came at this from very different ways, and I'm like, "Hey, Jerome," and he's like, "Hey, Bill, both of us are interested in the same thing." So when Carol invited us to actually be able to come up, I attended the annual meeting in September, got a first peek of the house, was intrigued by some of the things I saw. And then Carol invited myself and Jerome to come up and spend time on a freezing cold, snowy couple days in December in Oberlin. Spend a lot of time poking around the house. So what we want to do today is share what we saw in the house and observations in the house, but also we're going to spend some time providing some context. So we're going to talk about the Evans in North Carolina, and we're going to talk about the Evans when they arrive in Oberlin and put together, connect some dots that I don't believe have been connected in this way in the past. So that's my preamble, and I'll turn it over to you, Jerome.
Good evening. My name is Jerome Bias, and I'm a furniture maker and cultural heritage practitioner. I specialize in the work of Thomas Day, a free black cabinet maker who is Castle County, North Carolina, which is just up the road about an hour. Actually, he was for a while he was a cabinet maker in Hillsborough, North Carolina, at the time that the Evans family was in there. The Evans brothers were there. I have a picture of a bed here, and I put that there to give an example of the power of what the work that we're doing and the work that you're doing there at the Henry Bruce at the Wilson Bruce Evans house. That's a bed that's a reproduction of a bed that Thomas Day made and I made that bed and I made it. I had never made a piece of furniture before, but I always liked the idea of making furniture with hand tools. And I'd never seen one African American doing it. And then I found out about Thomas Day on a complete lark. And I saw the bed and I went, ooh, I like it. The bed was also $11,000. And I decided I'll make it. And so out of nowhere, I made that bed. And that's the power of what we're doing and what you're doing, of introducing new things information to different people around the country. We're going to and so we're going to start off looking at where people are. We're going to do an overview real quick of you guys are in Ohio, Oberlin, Ohio. And the second arrow down the bottom is Oberlin is Hillsborough, North Carolina. And that's where the Evans brothers were at the time in the 1850s. And we're going to go to the next slide. The great state of North Carolina. And so they're in Orange County in the middle right there in the middle is Hillsborough. Up north of there is where Thomas Day is, and he's one of the biggest competitors to Henry Evans. Thomas Day is the largest cabinetmaker in the state of North Carolina, and the Evans brothers are in Hillsborough. Now they're sending furniture all around the state. We know they're sending stuff as far west, far south, and east as Raleigh, North Carolina, which is that's going to show up later as we talk about their Uber system that they had going. All right. So,
And there's where Jerome is. Jerome's right in the thick of all this in Graham, North Carolina.
I'm right in the middle.
So maybe some context of distances, Milton and Hillsborough, or
Milton and Hillsborough are about 45 minutes away by drive, about 50 miles.
yeah. So right there on the Virginia border.
Right there on the Virginia border. And we're going to start off a little bit about Thomas Day. He was a free black cabinetmaker, Caswell County, North Carolina. We're starting off with him, and partially because he's one of the best documented black tradespeople we have in the country. We have his shop that he worked in, and this is it, the Union Tavern. On the first floor, he had a shop and a ware room, and on the second floor, he had his home where him and his children and his wife lived. And it's a fairly large, commodious building, and it's about the same size as the building that is it Wilton Hall?
Walton.
Walton Hall, which is where the Evans brothers had their shop in Oberlin, Ohio. Now we got another shot here. Recently, the Thomas Day Museum was presented to the state of North Carolina, and the state of North Carolina opened it up as a state historic site. And we were so very lucky to get many descendants of the Thomas Day family there. And we have one on the left-hand side, one of the youngest members of the family there, shaving away. And here we are with some other folks who are teaching them, actually, she's a descendant of Thomas Day too, making shavings with the hand plane. It's the power of what we're doing, of teaching younger folks about history and about this wonderful history of African Americans in the United States. And so we begin. In 1841, in 1841, this is an ad that was in the Hillsborough Recorder that Henry Evans had put in the newspaper. And there are a couple things to note in there. One, he's got a large store of furniture. And it's a variety. He has a large store of furniture. It's coming in a variety of woods, mahogany, walnut, and other choice woods. He's also taking pine and poplar and oak and faux grain painting it, and to look like rosewood, mahogany, and walnut. So he's got a huge skill set there. It's also interesting to note in here that he's saying he's got the latest conveniences. for making furniture. What he's actually saying, what he's saying in multiple words there is that he's got mechanization. More than likely, he's got a steam engine of some sort going in 1841. We don't know what it is, but he's got something there that's allowing him to produce a fairly large number of pieces of furniture. I also want to note that he's in this ad, he's describing a wide variety of furniture that he's got, but he doesn't say he has the latest styles. So he's producing high-end, nice furniture, good, well-made furniture at a good price, but he's not trying to be the cutting edge. And that's going to give us a hint as we start looking at what type of furniture he's producing.
So this is the first ad that we see for Henry, right? And he
Right.
says, basically he's saying, thank you for your patronages in the past. Now I'm going upscale. I'm scaling this up with a larger establishment. He's 24 at that time, so he's been in business for at least a couple years. And maybe part of the scaling up is Wilson was 17 in 1841. Maybe he was coming on board as well.
It's also interesting to note that um, he's got a carriage system going on there. In his ad, he's saying that wherever you are within reasonable distance, he will bring the furniture to you. That also includes picking up your old furniture, bringing it back, and refinishing it. To go along with that, he's also providing accommodations for travelers. He's got a carriage, a hack, and a buggy, all great for moving people around the state. And it's really cool because that lets him have, uh, in some areas, you're going to find cabinet makers are just serving their immediate area. He's serving a much broader, wider area of at least 50 to 60 miles away, which is a really powerful experience and really powerful tool for allowing him to be very financially sufficient. This is 1848. You're also going to notice that in the on the ad on the right-hand side, the second part of that, the bottom half of that, is a $25 reward from a person an enslaved person who has self-manumitted themselves. This is the South, and at the same time that we've got a free black man doing all this and being very prosperous, you've got enslaved folks in the same experience. So we started asking the question, when we go to look for furniture from the Evans brothers, what should we be expecting to see? Well, we know that he's on the left-hand side, in the top corner, that's a bed that was made by the Moravians, and they were making this bed. We have multiple examples of them making this bed and versions of it from 1820 to 1860. It's a little bit on the retarded side. But we also know that Henry Evans isn't saying he's making the most fashionable things in the world. He's just saying he's making really good furniture. On the right-hand side, we've got a bureau and a bedstead that was made by Thomas Day. Thomas Day is making furniture for the elite of the state and for common people too, but he's tended to make the more cutting-edge stuff. And that's where you have the Empire with the Empire Bureau with the flame veneer and the spool bed down there.
I would encourage everybody, if you're not familiar with Thomas Day, and Jerome could do a whole nother presentation just on Thomas Day, but his work is very well known, very definitely has a style. But I would encourage you to Google it if you're not familiar and see some of the work that he did, because as a free black cabinet maker who's a contemporary of the Evans and somebody that the Evans were competing with each other, as
Right.
we'll see. That's very interesting.
So when we went looking for furniture that we know we know that the Evans brothers made, we came up with there weren't a whole lot of answers and a whole lot of examples. But what did come forward were these tables. They're what we call DN tables, and it's a banquet table system. You bring the two of them together, and you have a banquet table. They're really cool in that they're found in Greensboro, North Carolina, made about 1850, and they've got turned legs. And that turning, the idea of turned legs with with the spooling going on there is going to show up multiple times later in the presentation. You're also going to know that these tables were made at the same time from the veneer that's on there. Between the two sides, the veneer matches, and you can tell that they were cut from the same flitch. Same piece of wood, multiple slices were made to make the veneer. And now we can go to the next slide. The table's really excellent in that it has Henry Evans' name in Hillsborough, North Carolina on the underside. We don't know if he signed it or if this is just a piece of wood that his name was stamped on, but we know it gives us a direct tie to Henry Evans. The other cool thing to see is that the turnings on the legs. They're very neat and tight and tidy and very well done, which is telling me a lot about the skill set of the person who's running the lathe that's turning the legs for him. It's a high-end skill set there and able to do really fine work. Now, we also have a fair number of pieces in the area that have, well, not a fair number, we have 2 or 3 pieces in the area that have a oral history of being connected to Henry Evans. This is a desk that's in southern yellow pine. It's nailed together and pegged together at different points. And it's at the Orange County Courthouse, and Hillsborough is the county seat for Orange County. And it's still upstairs in the courthouse, and it was made for the judge. It's kind of cool and neat that it's got this really, if you look at on the right-hand side, the spool turnings that support the rail are really neat and tight, and those are really cool. But the rest of it is kind of rough and kind of it's sturdy, but it's kind of rough, and I find myself wondering, okay, was this really them? But it has an oral history of being made by Henry Evans, and so we have to honor that. And now we're going to go to St. Now we know that from the church records of St. Matthew's, we know that Henry Evans was Episcopalian. He was baptized Episcopalian, and he was confirmed. And he did all this at St. Matthew's Church in Hillsborough, North Carolina. While there, he made the chancel furniture, which would be the furniture at the front of the church. That furniture is no longer there. There is, however, a balcony in the back, and the balcony rail, its oral history is that it was possibly made by Henry Evans. The church does have in their possession a chair that they believe was made by Henry Evans, and it's here on the right. If you look at the crest rail, which is that top railing there, it has little curly cues on the end. That's showing that it's made in the 1840s, 1850s, somewhere in there, using a little bit of that Greek revival style. And then again, once again, if you look at the front legs, they're turned, which is all about that system of someone in the shop is using a lathe and is really good at it. Now, we know that Henry Evans is sitting in this church. We don't know exactly where he's sitting, if it's in the balcony or if it's down on the floor or where in the church he's sitting. But we also know that in the same church, he's sitting with a judge, a North Carolina judge by the name of Thomas Ruffin. And Thomas Ruffin was given a case of an enslaver had rented out an enslaved woman, and she to a man, and she got in a dispute with the person who was renting her, and he shot and killed her. And he went to court over the matter because the initial owner was like saying, "You damaged my property," and Thomas Ruffin ruled on that, and his answer to that was this quote: the power of the master must be absolute, to render the submission of the slave perfect. In short, if the enslaver has to kill the enslaved person, so be it. So Henry Evans is sitting in the same congregational space as people who have really extreme ideas of of how to treat other people. 1847, between 1844 and 1847, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill is expanding their dorms. And so we have Old East and Old West. This is Old East. No, this is Old West, excuse me. And it had a 1/3 addition added to it. You can kind of see see it on the left end there. And several people were invited to bid on the contract. And Henry Evans was one of them. So they're taking and the contract was to build all the interior furniture and all the interior trim work. And that included the library and the debating hall. So in 1847, Henry Evans is taking on big projects. He's willing to bid on big projects. He's got a lot of capability. Unfortunately, he didn't get the bid. Thomas Say did, and he did very well with it. And it was he did very well for the contract from it. When we look at the 1850s manufacturing census, we get a really clear, a surprising idea of what's going on with this shop and what the Evans are up to. We find that he's actually the third largest cabinet maker in the state of North Carolina. Thomas Say is the #1 cabinet maker in the state, producing the largest amount of furniture. But these guys, Henry and Wilson are coming in third. And they're third to William Thompson in Raleigh. They've got at least 4 employees working at the shop. That does not include the two Henry and Wilson. So there are a total of at least 6 people. That doesn't include the possibility that they might have been renting enslaved folks that also work the shop. And they're producing a prodigious amount of material. We know that they're producing at least 100 bureaus a year and 100 bedsteads a year. That's a lot of furniture. And I find it really amazing that we've got 2 tables, a chair, and a desk that we sort of think our Henry Evans is. We're seeing this stuff all around us, and we just don't know it. Which is finally amazing, absolutely amazing. And I suspect that there in Oberlin, you guys are seeing stuff that they made and you just don't know it either. In 1850, Henry is doing something that a lot of other cabinet makers are doing too, in that they're providing caskets. People die, you need a wooden casket to be buried in. And he's not just providing the casket, but he's providing undertaking services. Many cabinet makers in the state are doing in the country are doing this, and it's a quite lucrative experience. And so I want to talk about. This is a picture of. John Scott and his family. They're from Fayetteville, North Carolina, and they moved to Oberlin, Ohio. We don't have a picture of Henry Evans and his family, but we do have this picture. And I wanted to show this picture to give us an idea to remind us and to remind us that this is a prosperous Black family who are expecting a certain level of dignity in the world. And here in North Carolina, they're not getting it. And by in 1831, in Southampton, Virginia, there's Nat Turner did a rebellion. And in response to that, the state of North Carolina the white population in North Carolina in many ways loses its mind and gets terrified and goes after his free Black population. They make it effectively impossible for people to buy themselves and manumit themselves. They also make it impossible for people free Blacks to come into the state. They make laws, they make the laws so that if a free black person leaves the state and stays gone for more than 90 days, they can't come back. Now, the effect of this is that, and they also do things such as pass laws saying that we will not provide funding for education of free black children. So these prosperous black families are having to send their kids out of state to be educated. After 90 days, they can't come back. That's not a great incentive for people to stay. We're also finding that in the state of North Carolina, mobs of white terrorists are breaking into the richest black families' houses and terrorizing them. In Orange County, North Carolina, we're seeing that in 1830, they had a population of free blacks of 15.5% of the county. 15.5% of the population was free blacks. By 1840, that goes down to 2.9%. People are leaving. It's not safe. Often what you're seeing, and often what you see is that you'll see that one or two people will leave, get established, prove that an area up north is safe, and then their extended family would come along. In this case, we find that Henry and Wilson's sister, Delilah, went up to Oberlin, Ohio with her husband, John Copeland. And then she does that in 1843. John Copeland was a carpenter. And later, she leads the rest of the family. The rest of the family follow her up there to Oberlin. And so that's 1853, the 1840s. And here in 1852, we find that Henry is starting to get ready to leave. So he starts selling property. He's got a 185-acre plantation that's just south of town by 2.5 miles. And this site has a house, a barn, and a stables on it. We don't think he's living there because we have another ad that's going to show up a little bit later that shows that he's living at his house and his house in town, and he's living upstairs and his shop is downstairs. And that's going to show up in one of our later slides. So that's 1852. And here we are in 1853. In November 1853, he puts his house up for sale. And it's really interesting. This is a really interesting ad in that he's saying that he's going to continue to work all the way. This is November of 1853. He's putting this ad out. And he's saying he's going to continue to work until December 25th. And then he's going to have a massive sale. He also lists that he's selling his tools, his benches, his turning lathe, and his hand screw. It's interesting to note that he's not selling a steam engine. But that's all right, because we also know that Thomas Day, when his shop was broken up, we knew he had a steam engine, but it wasn't sold either. It was either privately sold ahead of time, perhaps. But this is where they gather, getting ready to, they're leaving. This is in November of 53, and they're gathering a huge amount of money in order to do this. That's 1853.
It's interesting in that ad too. He's talking about his household furniture is for sale, but also new furniture that's in stock. So it's very clear that he's living and working in the same building in Hillsborough.
Now, in order for a free black family to travel safely between North Carolina, where they have an established community and people know them, and that people know their not just their personality, but their character. In order to remain safe, they've got to have paperwork. They've got to have papers. And so Henry goes to the governor, David Settle Reed, in April 22nd of 1854, and gets papers saying it's okay for him to travel to Ohio. And this is papers for his whole entire family. And so that's April 22nd of 1854. And this is when they shoot up the Oberlin real fast.
Yeah, so I'm gonna pick it up from here
Okay.
and kind of paint a picture of uh, setting up business in Oberlin. And there's been a lot of confusion in the record, some of it having to do with the change of the name of Mill Street to Vine Street, this idea that their shop was moved to Mill Street and so forth. So I think we've got a little bit of new information, but also this is hopefully a new organization of this material and paints a clear picture of their professional lives while they're in Oberlin. So we have them departing North Carolina on April 22nd. On May 11th, just 3 weeks later, Wilson Bruce Evans purchases the property on Mill Street that is now where the Italianate house stands on Vine Street. So it's pretty obvious that probably the Copelands were greasing the skids, were looking for property, maybe helping to look for property for the Evans. Maybe there was a trip made up earlier. Something had to take place in order for them to be able to find a property and close on it that quickly. At the time, they paid $500. Wilson paid $500 for that property. The building that was there is likely the white frame building that's on the back of the brick house, and there was another building behind it, a more square building. 2 years later, Oberlin College sold Walton Hall to Mr. Evans, which is Henry Evans. And Walton Hall was situated on Main Street. And there's some descriptions here from when it was used as a dorm. This was a student writing about it, saying it's 2 stories high, has 8 rooms to each story. The rooms are not as large as those in Colonial Hall and do not contain so many bugs, but there are enough there. Somewhere there was a description saying it was the closest that Oberlin ever got to a frat house. Then there's this in this Camp City directory in 1873, so it's looking back in time. It's saying about the year 1856, Wilson B. Evans and his brother Henry, who had been working at cabinet making 2 years on East Mill Street, bought this building, Walton Hall, having moved it down to the street, occupied it as a shop and store. So we were trying to figure out what are they saying about moving this building? And Gary is really the one who had the correct insight on this that I think is absolutely correct. If you look at this 1857 map of Lorain County that also has business listings on it, the red arrow is pointing to the H. Evans and Brothers shop at on Main Street. And that is Walton Hall. If we look at other maps from Oberlin College, you definitely identify that as Walton Hall. If you look north, and if you go, of course, you see Mill Street there. If you go up north, that's College Street. So we're right in the middle of that block, right across from the old school. But just north of the Walton Hall, you see that all the buildings are flush with the street. And I believe that's called the commercial block up there. So that's very typical retail, commercial. Your front door is right on the sidewalk. Walton Hall is set down. I believe that Gary is correct that moving the building down to the street just means fronting it on the street. Very likely that the building was built on brick piers. So therefore, there's no plumbing, there's no electricity, none of that infrastructure. It would be pretty easy just to roll it down the number of feet that it would take to get there. The other thing that this map tells us is it shows us, and it's kind of lost in the crease here, but that arrow on the right is pointing to Wilson Bruce Evans' home, and there it is on Mill Street. And you see it's a square building that's back from the street and flush with the face of the house next door. If we look at the 1859 Oberlin City Directory, and these directories are good for saying, establishing not only where people work, but also where their residence was. So they're showing the furniture warerooms of the Evans brothers being on Main between Mill and College. So that's the Walton Hall building. And then Evans Wilson is living on Mill Street between Main and Water. You look at the 1860 census. There's Henry Evans and his family, and his next door neighbor is Sidney Bedortha. This is Sidney Bedortha's shop. Sidney is he's a white cabinet maker from Massachusetts. He's about 4 years older than Henry. He is right next door. Uh, Interestingly, I think it's pretty definitive that Henry and his family were living above the store on Main Street while Wilson and his family were living on Mill Street. It's possible when they all arrived in Oberlin initially, maybe they were all living on Mill Street until the Walton Hall purchase. Interestingly, just looking at the property values there, Henry Evans' real estate value is 3,600, and Sidney Bedortha next door, who had been in Oberlin since at least 1850. His property is 2,000, but his personal property is a little more, and that could be he by that time spent more on steam equipment and so forth. This is a listing that Henry Evans and Brothers started running in the Lorain County News in January of 1863, and it ran on the front page, the first column. There's a listing of local businesses, and it ran in every single issue for a little over a year, with the same typos appearing issue after issue. But here's H. Evans and Brother, general undertakers and cabinet makers and dealers in furniture in Oberlin. So they are cabinet makers, furniture dealers, undertakers. Sidney Bedortha, who is his next door neighbor, just happens to have a listing right above him. And then the Waterman and Peak is the mill that, if you are familiar with the area now, that's Main and Vine Street where the Midas is now. This mill changed names a number of times, and we're going to be talking more about the mill, but their listing was appearing there as well. And for an entire year, they offered for awing instead of sawing, but guess nobody was calling out typos. So what else do we know about Henry Evans and Brother? If you look at the census going back to 1850 when they're in North Carolina and carry it forward, you see how their occupation is being recorded. In 1850, they're both cabinet makers. 1860 in Oberlin now, they're both cabinet makers. 1870 is kind of a pivotal year, and we'll talk about that more. Henry is listed for the first time as an undertaker. And sure, he was doing undertaking before, but his primary business was cabinet maker. And in 1870, Wilson is showing up as a wood turner. And then you see Henry, no occupations are listed past 1873 in city directories and census. And then Wilson Bruce Evans kind of alternates between undertaker and cabinet maker, whatever he felt like he was doing that day, I think. We can also, we looked at the 1850 manufacturing census in North Carolina. We can look at it in 1860 in Lorain County in Ohio. And we see that there are 3 furniture cabinet makers in Lorain County. It's Henry Evans and Brother, it's Sidney Bedortha, the next door neighbor, and Hoyt and Penfield is another one. This does not appear to be as big an industry as it was in North Carolina. In total, these 3 shops employed 6 men. Again, the business owners are not included in that count. But the total gross profit for all 3 shops is $818, which in today's money is about $31,000. It does not seem to be as big a business, as robust a business. And maybe some of this had to be, geographic, as Jerome was talking about. In North Carolina, they were really pushing, we'll bring the furniture to you if you can't come to us. So maybe it was a difference of strategy and market. Those of you who live in Oberlin and know that block between College and Vine on Main Street, I want you to envision this industrial parade, this procession that took place in 1860 in the October issue of the Lorain County News, where they are showing off all of the industry with the Evans are in there in the parade showing off some of their upholstery work. Right behind them is the mill that we talked about, and the mill actually had a steam engine and a power planer, going down Main Street. So just a charming exhibit and pride in the industry that is taking place in Oberlin. So that was 1860. In 1863, you remember the contract that Henry Evans bid on UNC Chapel Hill that Thomas Day got. Well, here's a contract that he bid on in Oberlin for the college. The Italianate, the new ladies' hall was being built, and they won the contract for the furniture to furnish the building. And it's interesting to look at this newspaper account and you can get an idea of the division of the trades. So Waterman and Peak, which is the mill, that's the name at the time, they were providing all the doors, window sash, for the new dorm, the new ladies' hall. A gentleman named Lyman Hill, who was a carpenter early in his career, and as he got older, he was a joiner and trim carpenter. He was putting up cornice in the new hall, and the Evans brothers were getting the furniture job. To Jerome's point that this furniture is out there and we're seeing it, we just don't know it. Somewhere somebody has a chair or a table that they know the provenance, they know it came from the old ladies' hall at Oberlin College. Unfortunately, it's just we only have one piece that is actually signed and marked, so there's not a wealth of information to start saying this is an Evans style, but it is certainly out there. They produce so much furniture. This is a newspaper article from November 18th, 1863, that is talking about the use of steam in the shops of the Henry Evans and brother and Sidney Bedortha next door. That both of them are using a moderate amount of steam engine mechanization, probably moderate as compared to the plane just down the block. Uh, Jerome and I have talked about this a lot. What would be the equipment that they would definitely want in their shop, and maybe what's the first piece of equipment they would buy? Because remember, they came to Oberlin, they'd sold all the tools, so they're starting from scratch and building a new shop. Absolutely, you would want a planer. They are buying stock, rough sawn, large stock from the mill, and then bringing it up the hill to the shop where they are planing it to the thickness that they need for their furniture. Definitely a lathe for turning those table legs, mortise and tenon machine for making the joinery, and probably a saw, a table saw or a bandsaw, but definitely employing some steam machinery in their shop. Unfortunately, we know with certainty that they had a steam-powered planer in the shop, and that's because in 1861 there was a rather terrible accident where Henry Evans was running a plane like this. And I will tell you that right here, this is a cutting head that is rotating rapidly as the board is being pushed through and it's being planed down to thickness. That thing is spinning terribly fast. Well, somehow an iron wrench was either sitting on the crossbar up here, or it was sitting overhead and got jostled loose, fell into that cutter head, and sent off like a rocket into Henry's head, unfortunately. So badly damaged his face, his eye, and so forth. So terrible, grisly accident that does tell us that they had steam machinery. In the same newspaper, the same issue that told about that account, or that reported the accident, H.E. Peck, who was a leader in the community, he had written a letter to the paper, basically asking, expressing his sadness that this had happened. And he says that a previous accident, which long crippled him, and the losses growing out of his confinement in jail while under indictment for being concerned in the Oberlin Wellington rescue, so far taxed his resources that for nearly 2 years he hardly had been able to support his wife and 7 little children who took to him for their bread. This new adversity will certainly bring actual want into his household if his friends do not offer relief. So he had had some kind of previous injury from an accident, a crippling injury, and now he had this horrible injury from the planing accident. A couple months later, this accident happened in January. In March, here's another appeal in the paper that Henry's making a long, slow recovery. But please, if you're thinking about new furniture, please frequent his shop and help him out. So let's go back and extend the timeline. So we've already talked about this. They moved from North Carolina in 1854. They bought the property on Mill Street, now Vine Street. They bought Walton Hall. 1858, September of 1858, Henry and Wilson participate in the Oberlin Wellington rescue, the rescue of John Price. And I'm sure all of you know that history, so we won't go into that. Following that, of course, there were months of uh, disruption and the trials until ultimately Henry and Wilson were among those who were jailed at Cuyahoga County Jail in Cleveland. So all of this is a big disruption to their business. In 1860, in October of 1860, Henry was appointed sexton for the Oberlin Society, which means that he was the chief undertaker for the local graveyard, the cemetery, which was originally at Morgan and Professor Streets. So this is a full-time, not full-time, but this is, he is responsible for that cemetery. I'm not sure if he ever started that gig because then in January, he was supposed to have the sexton role in 1861. In January is when he had his planer accident. So maybe he was able to do it later in the year, but certainly he wasn't in great condition. So that's 1861. 1863, things are starting to turn around. This is when they start running those weekly little blurbs in the paper advertising their business. And this is when they were awarded the contract for the ladies' hall furniture. Things are turning around. They're busy. Then 1864 comes and fire burns down Walton Hall. It also burnt down Bedortha's shop next door. I had asked Gary, many times if he had ever found the newspaper account reporting on this, and he hadn't. And I finally found it. And ironically, or not ironically, but for some reason, it's 6 lines. But this is in the Lorain County News. It's the same issue where the last ever H. Evans and Brother listing appears. Says carelessness. A block of buildings in town was again threatened with fire the other day from the careless igniting of some dry shavings and other combustibles, which sounds like a shop. People cannot be too careful in handling matches and such. So this is almost certainly, going through the Oberlin newspapers and any newspapers in any town of that time, there were so many fires, and some of them got the full dramatic, full page account. And this day, it just got a little blurb here. So fire burns down Walton Hall. At the same time, the business listings in the newspaper stop. And then in August of the same year, Wilson Bruce Evans enlists in the Union Army and serves for 10 months. So I'm going to go back and talk about the mill real quick, and then we're going to get into the house. So in this listing, you see Sidney Bedortha, you see H. Evans Brother and Waterman and Peak, which is the mill down here at the current Midas at the corner of Mill and Main Street. This was a robust mill, and it went through a number of owners and different partners. Lyman Colburn bought into, I can't remember in what year when he bought into it. Lyman Colburn, it doesn't seem like any grass grew under his feet. He held patents. He was inventing things. He always had a marketing scheme of some sort, it seems. So here in 1866, he's announcing that we're scaling this business up. We have a new planing machine. Another ad in 1866, selling blinds, and he actually had patented a piece of equipment to make blinds. 1870. This is interesting, and we'll come back to it in a little bit. This is the first time that the Colburn Mill ever advertises newels, balusters, and handrails. So these are staircase parts. These are turned parts that are produced on a lathe, as Jerome mentioned back in the North Carolina piece. So hold that thought. And then they just continued and continued to expand this business. So all of this, the whole point that I want to leave you with is that this was a robust business. They were churning out a lot of product. In 1864, after the fire, the Evans brothers joined with a gentleman named a white chairmaker named L.W. Butler, who had been working in Sydney Bedorth's shop next door. He and the Evans brothers went down to the mill and built a little addition on the side of the mill and operated their business out of that space until 1964 or 1965 or 66, according to this account, when Butler went west. Now, remember, they had a solid relationship with the mill. That's where they were getting all their material for their business. This bird's eye map from 1868, the arrow at the bottom right, that's where the mill is. And probably kind of pointing to where that space that they built might have been. The arrow at the top is where their shop would have been before it burned. So L.W. Butler leaves town in 65 or 66. Then in 1866, there's a report in the newspaper that H. Evans and brother are laying the foundations for a new building to be used as a furniture wareroom. It will stand on the site of their old shop. So it looks like they're rebuilding. They're going to move back up the street and get back at it. Well, maybe not. Either that was erroneous reporting or there was a change of plans, because the next year, in 1867, there's reporting that the site of the old Evans cabinet shop on South Main, which after the fire of 64 presented such a discouraging appearance to anyone interested in the beauty of that part of town, is now a building lot whereon Mr. Evans has erected a handsome frame dwelling, which is now receiving the finishing touches. So either the reporter said, "Oh, looks like they're rebuilding," and got the story wrong, or else there was a change of plans, and Henry instead built a house there, and it seems to be a house that he and his family would live in. Next year, there's an ad that starts running from 1868, ran until May of 1869, where Henry's now advertising two dwelling houses pleasantly situated near the business part of the village up there, that commercial block. One is new, just built, the other nearly new. So it appears that he has built the house for his family, then he's built another one on the property, and now he's trying to sell both. Henry appears to be trying to unwind things in Oberlin, and he's being pulled more and more to DC, as we'll see. So following that 1867 newspaper story that the Evans were rebuilding their shop and then they didn't, there are no more references to the Henry Evans and brother cabinet maker shop. They continue to be referenced as cabinet makers in the census, but it would appear that any work they're doing, they're actually doing out of the planing mill. Particularly telling, if you remember, in 1870 in the census, Wilson Bruce Evans is identified as a wood turner. Jerome and I feel pretty sure that he was, among other things, operating the lathe in the cabinet making shop, turning legs and so forth. But the only reason to be identified specifically as a wood turner in the census is if that's all you're doing and you're doing it for somebody else. I think Lyman Colburn, who's constantly expanding that mill, he knew Wilson Bruce Evans' capabilities on the lathe. He said, "Man, I want to start offering large turned items, newel posts, balusters, and so forth. Can you run the lathe?" And I believe that's what he was doing. There's even an ad that mentions Mr. Evans at the sash factory, which is another reference to that mill. Meanwhile, Wilson Bruce Evans is continuing the undertaking business. Here's yet another fire. He was in a building up Main Street where John Scott was also operating at the time. And it's just saying that Mr. Evans, the undertaker, was able to save his stock and is back in business. So you see the multiple roles. He's working at the mill. He's also continuing the undertaking business. 1871 is the first that we see Henry Evans in DC. He opened an account with the Freedmen's Bank in DC. He lists his permanent residence as Oberlin, Ohio, but he's temporarily staying in DC. So when the brick Italianate was built, we know for sure it was sometime in the 1870 to 1880 decade. Uh, Judging from tax records and so forth, most likely it was in the first half of that decade. One possible clue is again another tragic one. One of Henry Evans' daughters was badly hurt when a sidewalk tipped onto her during its construction on Mill Street. So at the time, there was a sidewalk ordinance in Oberlin, and it seems like just about every paper there was a sidewalk ordinance notice where people were being told they needed to build a sidewalk or repair the sidewalk in front of their home. Homeowners were responsible for building and maintaining the sidewalk in front of their home. It's possible that this 1872, this sidewalk going in happens to be on Mill Street. Perhaps that is coinciding with construction of the house. Maybe. 1873, Henry Evans' home is still there in Oberlin. He's still maintaining that home. There was just some reporting of a spate of attempted burglaries, and his house was one of them. So he's maintaining that residence. By 1880, he's listed officially in the 1880 in the federal census in DC. And also in 1880, two huge parties, one with 200 guests, were held at the commodious residence on East Mill Street that belongs to Wilson Bruce Evans, one a wedding and one a birthday party. So we know, by 1880, that house was there. And 1880, just a notation that Henry and others had come home to vote. 1886, sadly, Henry dies at 69 in Oberlin. He was home and he fell from his house while repairing it last week and received serious injuries. Yeah, Jerome and I have talked, and Carol has talked, a 69-year-old guy who apparently is blind in one eye, has been crippled in some other way. What was he doing climbing on his house or a ladder to fix it? I think we see a lot of determination in Henry and Wilson Bruce Evans. Um, you were going to tell him he wasn't going to do it. And then to kind of close the circle, the funeral service was conducted out of Wilson Bruce Evans' house, of course, as the undertaker, probably using that dining room space for the viewing. All right, so all of this is to set some stage, and let's get into the house, finally. So what we know about the house is largely based on the National Historic Landmark nomination that was done years ago. But this is kind of, if you know anything about the Wilson Bruce Evans house, you know about the beautiful woodwork that the Evans brothers were responsible for. So as I mentioned, Jerome and I have a way of standing in the corners of old houses and picking apart the details. So we were thrilled to be able to have 2 days in the house to do just that and to see what we could find. Going into this, our questions are, what is architecturally or structurally interesting about this house? And what's interesting? That could be something that's atypical, it's unique, it's unexpected. It might be just puzzling for the period, the region, or the style. How does all the historic context that we talked about, how does that inform what we see in the house? And where can we find the Evans brothers in the house? All of which can help to inform the future interpretation of the home. So everybody knows the trim work in the house is stunning. Why? What makes it stunning? So I'm going to start with a little anatomy lesson. And you're all sitting in a room, I believe, probably that has doors and windows. And if you look at how they're trimmed out, this is pretty conventional trim work, where usually there's this face of the trim, and then as you work towards the outside of the door or the window, the trim gets thicker, it gets deeper from the wall. And that used to be done by this would be one piece, and this would be another piece, and this would be another piece. So maybe 3, 4 pieces built up. These days, if you go buy PVC trim, this whole thing is one piece that they have carved that profile in. But this is pretty typical. You have a flat board, and then you have some kind of a back band with a decorative profile like this. And in fact, this is the profile that's in the Oberlin house, the Evans house. And what happens is you create this right angle that is going to create a shadow line and really define a door or window. This is not the Wilson Bruce Evans house. This is another Italianate house, and you could be standing, at the same place in the Evans house. But if you look at the side of that door, you see that it is very well defined. There's a hard edge that really has a distinct shadow line. But something different and unconventional is happening in the Wilson Bruce Evans home. You don't see that hard shadow line. And if I zoom in on this for you, it looks like the trim is either receding to the wall, or Jerome and I have started talking about it. It's like the door is emerging, it's building out from the wall. And here's another look at it, and it's kind of hard to tell, but this is very low to the plaster, and then it gets higher and higher and higher. So what is going on here? If you are going to trim out a door or window and you want it to be impressive, 5 inches is about where you would start. My window trim in the room I'm in is about 4 inches. 5 inches, you're making a statement. In the Evans house, that flat board that the trim builds on is only 4 inches wide. In the Evans house, they're taking that same backband piece of molding, and instead of putting it on top of that board, they are adjoining it. So now you have 7 inches of width, but you have an ugly gap here, or a joint. You don't want to have 2 boards meeting and you can see that joint. So they have taken a piece of half round molding and covered that joint. This is what's creating that steep angle, that sense that the doors and the window trims are kind of coming out of the wall. So this dramatically increases the casing width by 2 inches while actually using a 20% narrower board over here. So it's efficient. So if we look at this trim again, you see how the profiles match up to my drawing. This is what's going on. And then this is a piece, this long piece here is an applied piece of half round. This is really cool. It is not one of a kind. We have found some other instances, but it is unusual to be sure. I talked to a guy I know on Instagram who has similar trim in his house in New York State, and he restores old houses. And he said, I've never seen another house around me with the trim done. And he had never heard another one until we started talking about the Wilson Bruce Evans house. So it's a very unique. Yeah, I always heard the best definition of creativity, if you believe that there's nothing new in the world, then creativity is taking existing elements and combining them, putting them together in a different way. This is what the Evans brothers did here. It's very cool. If you look at how door trim normally adjoins to the baseboard, it's not doing this. That door trim usually goes all the way to the floor. It might go down into a block. This is coming down, and the same profile is continuing right along the top of the baseboard. So it creates this very fluid line that goes all the way around the room, which is really cool. I haven't said nerdy yet, Jerome. This stuff is really nerdy, but it's so cool. So that trim, that same strategy goes all the way around these arched doorways, which is another thing that the Wilson Bruce Evans home is really known for. This is tough work, getting those profiles to line up along that arch, and the arch itself is difficult to do. You can see the arches in the house. Now, number one, this is 150 years after it was installed. So things happen, things move, things shift. It's December, wood shrinks. So we have to be forgiving of what we see here. But you can see the challenge of making this creative idea work. You can also see over here that they wound up with this piece of wood that in order to cut that out of cut that continuous arch out of a single piece of wood, that had to be a big board to start with. And either it wound up being cut too short or the board just wasn't long enough. It would be terribly expensive just to scrap that and start over, so they made do. So you see this little triangular piece in there making it do. Uh, if you look at these doorways in the different spaces, you can see definitely the mark of different tradesmen. This is the trim around the front door on the inside. This is the best done of all the doors in there. And then if you look in the different parlors and really study the trim in a way that Wilson Bruce Evans would be horrified if he knew you were doing it, you can definitely see some different skill levels in there. But this is not easy stuff. So one of our questions was, how common are these arched doors? Are they seen anywhere else in Oberlin? So actually, before we went up there, I was just on Zillow looking around at period homes in Oberlin and found this house, which Carol was kind enough to be able to get us invited in there for a few minutes one morning. And this was the photo I saw on Zillow. You're like, okay, that looks really familiar. We want to see that. So we went in the house and we had a few minutes as this kind couple was trying to rush off to work, and Oberlin and Jerome and I were crawling around on their floors and taking photos and nosing around. And those doors are trimmed out with that same profile that we saw in the Wilson Bruce Evans house. In fact, this is a tool called a profile gauge that I had used to capture the profile from the Evans house, and then did the same thing in the Drake house and put it up against my drawing, and it's identical. So this is not terribly surprising. In this time period, if you were going to a mill to buy millwork for your new house, if you were going to that mill in Oberlin, they would have a molding book that you would go through, and you would look at different patterns and you say, yeah, I want that one. And here you see that profile is the bottom piece of panel molding on that page. So at first we thought, it was the same molding, but it was applied in that conventional way. It was not the inverted Wilson Bruce Evans style. We started in this room back here, which I believe is the kitchen. We looked at the kitchen side of this arch. It was applied conventionally. We looked at this side of the arch. It was applied conventionally. We came over here, looked at this side of the arch. It was applied conventionally. You can even see that shadow line down here. Then we went in this room, and this is the front parlor. So this is the most formal. This is your presentation space. And in that room, they had applied it in the inverted, excuse me, fashion, like, okay, I've been waiting for a cough to catch up with me. Hopefully it won't carry on. Um, so this was really interesting to see. It's a little different. Instead of having a half round, they've got a flat piece, a walnut on here. They've got a different profile here instead of it being flat. But it was interesting to see it in there. You remember when I talked about shadow lines, particularly if you're painting the trim, having that shadow line is very important. At some point before the current owners in the house, the trim around the windows in that room was painted, and you can see how the trim just kind of fades into the wall there. Carol went into another house for us, Lyman Colburn. If you remember, he's the owner of the mill. And in that house, you have arched doorways again. They're simpler than the ones in the Evans house. They do have the same molding profile, but it's applied in the conventional means. All right. We'll get into a little speed talk in here so we can wrap up and have time for questions here. So what's interesting about the millwork or the trim work in that house? To me, it's the creative installation of a standard machine milled molding profile for dramatic effect. The molding was almost certainly produced at the mill, right there at Main and Mill. The same profile appears in other nearby homes. And seems to be a focus on being economical with material. They're making it work. And there seems to be the work of several tradesmen in installing that trim in the house, but to very dramatic effect. So I think, it's interesting It's one thing to say it's beautiful woodwork. It's another thing to understand what's really going on with it, and it's pretty cool and creative. Jerome, you want to jump in, please?
Sure. It's one thing is interesting. If we go back at the original ads we had for Henry Evans in Hillsborough, North Carolina, he points out that he's refinishing furniture, and he's also staining wood, pine, poplar, walnut, pine and poplar and oak to look like more expensive woods, most notably mahogany, walnut, and rosewood. And so, and that patterning shows up in this case. Let's stay on the page for a second. In that you got your interior doors, they're made out of butternut, i.e. white walnut. The door casings, windows and door casings are in oak and butternut. And the staircase the staircase, which is the newel, the balusters, and the handrail are all in walnut, but they're all universally stained together to look like dark walnut. And these are two doors from two different houses. The first house on the left-hand side, the door has been stripped, and you can see the grain of the wood, and that is not walnut. On the door on the right, this is in the Wilson Bruce Evans house, and it's got this wonderful walnut stain to it, and it's white walnut or butternut that's been stained to look like dark walnut.
I may roll through this one.
Sure.
So one of our questions is, what is the source of the millwork in the house? And the millwork includes your doors, your windows, your trim, and your newel posts, and so forth. Were the Evans brothers actually milling it themselves? Did they build the doors themselves? When that house was built in the 1870s, the Evans brothers no longer had their own shop. The brothers had a close working relationship, as we've said, with Lyman Colburn's large mill, which produced a full array of millwork for local homes. It appears that by 1870, as we've said, that Wilson Bruce Evans was working as a wood turner at the mill. It therefore seems nearly certain that all the millwork for the Wilson Bruce Evans home was produced by Colburn's mill. What that arrangement was, we don't know. Was it purchase? Was it trade? Was it employee discount? Could be any number of things. It also seems highly probable that Wilson Bruce Evans personally turned the newel, the balusters, and the handrail of the staircase in his new home while working at the mill. And the Evans, perhaps with the help of others, would have installed the millwork purchased from the mill, which is supported by the family tradition that the brothers installed that trim. Going back to the molding book, again, looking at doors and window designs and so forth, here's the Evans house door, basically, from that catalog. That right-hand door is very similar to the Evans house door, but it would have been, instead of having that wood panel in the center, I want to have glass. Staircase, again, these turnings are very likely the work of Wilson Bruce Evans, and it's also very likely that his turning work is in other Oberlin homes of the period. In the house already, the two newels on the left had been found in the loft earlier. We found two smaller newels in the loft over the rear frame portion of the building. So there's evidence of turning in the house. So it's pretty cool to be able to point to something with all the circumstantial evidence is pointing to Wilson being this being his handwork, to be able to look at these items in the house. Jerome?
When you look at the rear structure of the house, it's really we came to this and we had a lot of questions about this. Was it done first? Was it done second after the front of the house? Was it a workshop? And we came back with some really interesting observations. For starters, we found that there's a big piece of wood called a sill beam that's at the bottom and a plate at the top. And it's a big, huge timber that's 30 feet long. It's probably a 10 by 10, 10 inches by 10 inches. It's all 30 feet, it's 30 feet long. It's really major. And it's suggesting that it's been there for a while and is probably possibly made for this site. You're also finding that one of the questions we had was like you've got this door at the very top at the very top there. We were thinking that maybe this was part of a system of conveyance of storing furniture or storing wood in the attic space, the loft space. And we looked at it and came up with the answer that no, not really. This door was installed in the 20th century, so this is a new experience. Um, Also, when we're looking at the space, the question was like, was this a workspace up here? Should this be a lofted area? And in looking at it, we realized that at one point the ceiling has been, in recent memory, has been redone. There was a major beam going from north to south that's in the dotted line that was removed. And that was your major purloin that your ceiling joists were attached to. They would have gone left to right and attached to that. And then you would have had lath, plaster and lath attached to that. So there was a plaster ceiling actually attached to these beams. Now you also notice that on there that this beam that went from north to south, I believe it was, has a pocket right there at the bottom of the screen. And there's one right there. There's one on the next purloin, and there's another one further up there too. So there was actually two very large beams that formed your ceiling structure. Now, finally, we came up with like the question of like, okay, what's up with these boards that are up in the attic, in this attic space? Were they possibly furniture boards? Were they for making coffins or something like that? And we looked at them and saw, A, they're kind of thin, and B, they've got a tongue and groove on there and that's for bringing boards together and nailing them together. And that would have allowed you to have a floor up there of some sort.
So anytime woodworkers like Jerome and myself see 16-inch wide boards, we get excited. So yeah, there were theories about what was their purpose.
There's one interesting thing it's really cool and interesting and really weird. When they built the Italianate end of the house on there, they built it around the end of the wooden structure. And so what that means is that as we're pointing at that window in the Italianate section there, those bricks are not going all the way down to the floor. To the ground. They're actually sitting on the rafters of the wooden structure, which is very unusual. And you look at it and you go, oh my God, that won't last, that won't survive. But it's been there for 150 years. It's probably advisable to have a structural engineer come in and look at that and have their mouth fall open and help them out. That get too terrified as they're looking at this, but it would be advisable to have someone look at that.
Yeah, it was that photo on the right is me up there in the loft trying to even find how the bricks are supported and finally could feel them. And it's just the end rafter, the bricks are sitting on top of it and building up. And it's not like an arch that is self-supporting. They are totally dependent on those rafters. And of course, the rafters are dependent on the beams that are coming down. So it's a very interesting structure. I'll take this one,
All
Jerome.
right.
In the far back of that frame structure is a space that looks like it was used as a kitchen at some point. Um, Interesting. There's a clue there, and I don't know how to interpret the clue, and maybe somebody else will. There is what I would call fuzzy siding, this white or lighter siding on this wall and up here. And if you feel it, it's soft and it's furry. Down here, when I see that, it's usually in a smokehouse, and it's the effect in an old smokehouse, and it's the effect of salt in the wood that's actually creating that effect. I'm not sure what's happening here. We do think that there was a chimney stack on the back This is the south end, so it's the kind of the east half of the south end of the building. There are, you can see siding boards from about this height down that have been replaced. They're not the original siding that you see everywhere there. And on the outside of the building in the dirt, there appears to be a pad that a chimney would have been stacked on. When the chimney was taken down, they were left with a short piece of siding and a short piece of siding. So they pulled those off and filled it all in. So it seems like this was possibly used as a kitchen, but that effervescence of the wood is probably a clue to something. So our conclusion of the rear building, uh, is that along with the removed building that was further south from that originally, this was probably, it seems like it was the original residence of the Wilson Bruce Evans family, and does not appear to have ever been used as a cabinet maker, undertaker shop. And that was something I was kind of excited about when I first visited the house in September. That loft, it puzzled me, that loft door. But after spending more time with it, it doesn't seem like it was ever used for their business. We're getting close to the end, I promise.
We're almost there. When we arrived to look at the furniture, it was a very cold, snowy day. And so when we were in the storage unit, it was hard to go in there and pull all the furniture out and give it a thorough examination. So we did what we could in terms of looking at the more modern mass-produced furniture, pulling that and say, okay, yeah, this is not original. And these pieces might be, but we don't know. We did discover that there were a couple of tables that had turned legs. There were some other pieces of furniture that looked like they are, in particular, rockers that came from North Carolina that might have been of importance to the family. We did find some paperwork after we left there, after we left Ohio, we came back home. We went through some more research. We came back with some paperwork saying that, listing some of the pieces of furniture that were originally in the house, that the family suspected that Wilson Bruce Evans had worked on or made.
I have to tell you, I've been told that we have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to make sure that you.
Almost there.
4 minutes, you, Jerome, and you, Bill, are the hosts. So if I have to shut down here.
Oh, no.
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Keep going.
Basically, we don't know what the stuff is. We've got to come back and look at it and explore some more.
So this settee
Yeah.
is in the house and had been pulled out of the loft previously. And just funny, in the Oberlin newspaper, in all my research, I stumbled across this silly joke. What's the difference between a crockery dealer and a cabinet maker? One sells tea sets and the other settees. Yeah, grown. It's your paper. Um, so this settee is just fascinating. The handwork there is really unusual. This is kind of Eastlake style, which is later than when the Evans brothers had their shop. So it's a big question as to whether this was a piece of their work or whether this was something that a piece of important furniture. But I think that's kind of the point. You know, we made some observations and revelations, but this is always a continuing process where other people will look at this and build on and question and challenge our conclusions, and ultimately you'll learn more and more as this process continues. And Carol, I'm sorry we got you run out of the library going so long.
They're lovely to us here. I am going to disconnect, but I'm going to presume, Bill and Jerome, that you can continue and answer what questions there are. And this is being recorded, so I'll be able to catch up with that. And I will catch up with you shortly. I've been sitting here riveted by this. I am looking forward to watching it again. Thank you so much, and I better get out of here so our friends at the library will let us come back.
Well, thank you so much, Carol. We
Thank you so much,
appreciate it.
Carol.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, I was looking at the chat. Here I see the Q&A. We do have a couple questions. Um,
I think they've actually been sort of answered.
have we ever heard